The echoing jeers bounced off the wooden posts of the auction platform as Violet Greene stepped onto the worn planks. Sunlight beat down on Tonopah Junction, Nevada, in the merciless summer of 1878, but the heat from her shame burned hotter than any desert day. At 22, Violet had never felt more exposed than standing there while strangers assessed her worth based solely on her fuller figure. "Looks like we got us a big one today, boys," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the dusty town square. "Who's gonna need an extra-large wagon to cart this one home?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, men elbowing each other and women hiding smirks behind gloved hands. Violet kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to let her tears fall. She hadn't asked to be here. After her father's death left her with insurmountable debts, the bank had seized their small ranch outside town. With nowhere to go and no family to turn to, she'd been forced into indentured servitude, her contract now up for auction to the highest bidder. Starting bid at $15. The auctioneer called, his voice dropping noticeably from the previous lot, a petite blonde who'd fetched 40 to work as a housekeeper for the mayor's family. 10, someone shouted, followed by laughter. "Come now, gentlemen, she may be substantial, but think of the work she can do." $15. 12, but only because I need someone to muck out stalls, called a gravelly voice, bringing another wave of chuckles. Violet bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. She'd grown up in Tonopah Junction, had gone to church with these people, had baked pies for their socials. Now they looked at her as if she were livestock, her body the subject of cruel jokes. $50. The voice was deep, commanding, and so unexpected that a hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned toward the back, where a tall figure stood partially shadowed by the general store's awning. "I said 50, the man repeated, stepping forward. His spurs clinked against the packed dirt as he moved into the light. Violet's breath caught. She recognized Thomas Xavier immediately. Most everyone in 3 counties would. His cattle operation north of town was one of the most successful in Nevada, and he had a reputation for being fair but formidable. No one crossed Thomas Xavier and walked away unscathed. $50 from Mr. Xavier, the auctioneer announced, his mocking tone instantly replaced with deference. "Do I hear 55? The crowd had gone silent, shifting uncomfortably under Thomas's cold stare. His blue eyes moved from face to face, lingering on those who had been laughing the loudest moments before. "Anyone else?" Thomas asked, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. He didn't issue any explicit threat, but the message was clear in his stance and the hard line of his jaw. "Sold to Mr. Xavier for $50, the auctioneer declared hastily, banging his gavel. Thomas strode forward, his tall frame cutting through the crowd that parted for him like water. He paid the clerk without a word, then turned to Violet, who stood frozen on the platform. He extended a hand to help her down, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Miss Greene," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I believe we have business to discuss." Violet placed her trembling hand in his large, calloused one, stepping carefully off the platform. The crowd had begun to disperse, though many lingered, watching the unexpected development with undisguised interest. "Why?" she whispered as he led her away from the auction block. "Not here," Thomas replied curtly. "My wagon's over by the mercantile." They walked in silence, Violet acutely aware of the whispers following them. Thomas Xavier had never married, had never shown particular interest in taking a wife or even in the company of women beyond basic courtesy. What could he possibly want with her? His wagon was well maintained but simple, pulled by 2 healthy-looking bay horses. Without ceremony, he helped her up onto the wooden seat before climbing up beside her and taking the reins. "Mr. Xavier, Thomas," he corrected, his eyes fixed ahead as he guided the wagon down the main street. "And you don't need to thank me, Miss Greene." "It's Violet," she said automatically, clutching the edge of the seat as the wagon hit a rut in the road. "And I wasn't going to thank you. I was going to ask what exactly you expect from me," That earned her a sidelong glance, a flicker of something surprise, perhaps crossing his face before his expression settled back into its stoic mask. "Fair question," he acknowledged. "I need help at my ranch. My housekeeper left last month to get married, and things have gone to hell since then." Violet stared at him, not quite believing his explanation. "And you paid $50 for me because that's what you're worth." Thomas guided the horses around a bend in the road, leaving the town behind them. "A good housekeeper is hard to find. I don't care about your size, Miss Greene. I care about having someone competent running my household." She wasn't entirely convinced. Men didn't spend that kind of money without expectations, especially not men like Thomas Xavier, who had a reputation for shrewd business dealings. But as the wagon rolled northward, leaving Tanapa Junction's dusty streets behind, Violet found herself with little choice but to trust him at least for now. "My contract is for 1 year," she said quietly. "After that, I'm free to go," Thomas nodded. "That's the law." "And what exactly will be expected of me? Cooking, cleaning, managing the household supplies?" He glanced at her again. "Nothing improper, if that's what you're asking. You'll have your own room in the main house, meals provided, and Sundays off unless there's an emergency." It sounded too good to be true. Violet had expected to be purchased by one of the local businesses as a laundress or kitchen help, working 16-hour days in deplorable conditions. Or worse, bought by one of the saloons to serve drinks while fending off wandering hands. "Why did you really buy my contract, Mr. Xavier?" he sighed, slowing the horses as they approached a creek. "Thomas," he reminded her, "and I told you I need a housekeeper." There were 5 other women on that auction block today, all of them smaller and presumably more suited to housework than me. You could have had any of them for less than $50. Thomas stopped the wagon at the creek's edge, letting the horses drink while he turned to face her fully for the first time. His eyes were the color of the Nevada sky, clear blue and penetrating, set in a sun-weathered face that spoke of years working outdoors. "I don't like bullies," he said simply. "Never have. What they were doing back there wasn't right." The admission startled her. It seemed, too, personal for a man with Thomas Xavier's reputation. So this was charity. Violet felt a flush of embarrassment heat her cheeks. "No," he replied firmly. "This was me recognizing an opportunity. I need someone who can run a household, and you need a fair employer. The fact that I could put a few local jackasses in their place while making the arrangement was just a bonus." Despite herself, Violet felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "You're not what I expected." "I rarely am," he said, a hint of a smile ghosting across his lips before he turned his attention back to the horses. "We've got another hour's ride. The ranch is just past those hills." As they continued their journey, Violet studied her new employer's profile. Thomas Xavier looked to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck where it met his collar. His jawline was strong, dusted with a day's growth of beard, and his hands on the reins were steady and sure. She'd heard stories about him over the years, how he'd come to Nevada with nothing 10 years ago, and built one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the territory through sheer determination, and a head for business. People respected him, feared him a little perhaps, but no one ever spoke of kindness when they mentioned his name. Yet he had stood up for her when no one else would. The Xavier Ranch appeared as they crested a rise in the road. Nestled in a valley with a backdrop of purple-hued mountains, it was larger than Violet had imagined. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure built of solid timber, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings and corrals surrounded it, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on the lush grasses fed by the creek that wound through the property. "It's beautiful," she murmured, genuinely impressed. Thomas nodded, a hint of pride in his voice when he replied, "Took a lot of work to get it this way." As they approached the main house, a ranch hand emerged from one of the barns, raising a hand in greeting. Thomas returned the gesture before pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the porch. "Walter," he called to the ranch hand, "tell Mrs. Finch she can head back to town tomorrow. I've found a replacement." The ranch hand, a weathered man in his 50s, looked Violet over with undisguised curiosity. "Yes, boss," he said, tipping his hat to Violet. "Madam." Thomas helped Violet down from the wagon, then gestured toward the house. "Mrs. Finch has been filling in from town a few days a week, but she has grandchildren to look after. She'll be relieved." Inside, the house was larger than it appeared from outside, with high ceilings and spacious rooms. It was clean but Spartan, with functional furniture and few decorative touches, clearly a bachelor's home. "Kitchen's through there," Thomas said, pointing. "Pantry's well stocked. My room is upstairs at the end of the hall. Yours will be this one." He opened a door off the main entryway, revealing a modest but comfortable bedroom with a single bed, dresser, and small writing desk by the window. "It's more than I expected," Violet said honestly. Her family's ranch had been small, the house cramped and always in need of repair. This room was larger than the one she'd shared with her sister before Emma had married and moved to California. "Breakfast is at 5, Thomas informed her. "The men eat in the bunkhouse, but I take mine here. Lunch is informal, just leave something cold I can grab when I come in from the range." "Dinner at 7. I'm not particular about what's served as long as it's filling." Violet nodded, taking mental notes. It seemed straightforward enough. "Any questions?" he asked. A dozen, but only one seemed important at the moment. "Why did you really help me today, Mr. Xavier? And please don't tell me it was just because you needed a housekeeper." For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. His expression remained impassive, those blue eyes revealing nothing. But then he sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "My sister was a big woman," he said quietly. "She died 3 years ago, typhoid, but before that I saw how people treated her sometimes. It wasn't right then, and it wasn't right today." The simple honesty of his answer caught Violet off guard. She hadn't expected him to share something so personal. "I'm sorry about your sister," she said softly. Thomas nodded once, putting his hat back on. "I'll leave you to get settled. There's a trunk in the closet with some things Mrs. Finch left behind, dresses and such. Help yourself if you need anything. We can go into town next week for whatever else you require." With that, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing across the wooden floor and out the front door. Through the window, Violet watched him stride toward the barn, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. For the first time since the auction, she took a deep breath that didn't feel like it was caught in her throat. She wasn't free, her year of service still stretched before her, but somehow she felt like she'd been granted a reprieve. Whatever Thomas Xavier's true motivations, she was determined to prove her worth as his housekeeper. As promised, Mrs. Finch arrived the next morning, a bustling, no-nonsense woman in her 60s who gave Violet a quick but thorough overview of the household duties. The kitchen was well equipped, the pantry indeed generously stocked, and the routine straightforward. "Mr. Xavier's not one for fuss, Mrs. Finch explained as she showed Violet the linen closet. "Keeps to himself mostly, works harder than 3 men put together, and expects the same from everyone else. But he's fair. Pays on time and doesn't get into the drink like some ranchers." Violet nodded, absorbing the information. "Does he entertain much? Have visitors?" Mrs. Finch chuckled. "Lord, no. Man barely talks unless he has something worth saying. Only visitors are the cattle buyers twice a year and occasionally the banker from town. Oh, and his foreman eats at the house, sometimes Jacob Miller, decent sort. Been with Mr. Xavier since the beginning." By midday, Mrs. Finch had departed, leaving Violet alone in the large house. Thomas had left at dawn with several ranch hands to check on a distant part of the property, so she used the solitude to familiarize herself with every corner of her new domain. The house was spotlessly clean but lacked any feminine touches. No curtains softened the windows, no rugs warmed the wooden floors, and the walls were bare except for a single landscape painting in the main sitting room. It felt like a place where someone existed rather than lived. She prepared a simple dinner of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie, uncertain of Thomas's preferences but determined to make a good first impression. At precisely 7, he returned, washing up at the pump outside before entering through the kitchen door. "Smells good," he said by way of greeting, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Violet, suddenly nervous, gestured to the table she'd set. "I wasn't sure what you like to eat." "Food," he replied with that same ghost of a smile she'd glimpsed the day before. "I'm not particular." They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence for a few minutes before Thomas spoke again. "You settling in all right?" Violet nodded. "Yes, thank you. Mrs. Finch was very helpful." "Good." He took another bite of stew, then added, "This is good too. Thank you." She watched as he broke a piece of bread, noting the careful precision in his movements. Everything about Thomas Xavier seemed measured, controlled. "I was thinking, if it's all right with you, that the house could use some curtains, and perhaps a rug or two." Thomas looked up, seeming genuinely surprised by the suggestion. "Never thought about it, but yes, if you think it's needed." "It would make the place feel more like a home," Violet ventured. Something flashed in his eyes, a moment of vulnerability quickly masked. "Do whatever you think best." "There's money in the drawer in my study for household expenses." The conversation lapsed into silence again, but not uncomfortably so. After finishing his meal, Thomas pushed back from the table. "That was the best dinner I've had in months. Thank you, Miss Greene." "Violet," she reminded him with a small smile. "And you're welcome, Thomas." He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the small step toward familiarity, then excused himself to his study. As days turned into weeks, Violet settled into the rhythm of life at the Xavier Ranch. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning and baking, her afternoons mending and planning meals, and her evenings serving dinner to Thomas and occasionally Jacob, the foreman. Thomas remained something of a mystery, unfailingly polite but reserved, working from sunrise well past sunset most days. He seemed to appreciate the changes she made to the house, the cheerful yellow curtains in the kitchen, the braided rug in the sitting room, the wildflowers she placed in a mason jar on the dining table each day, but he rarely commented on them directly. It was Jacob who provided more insight into her employer, dropping casual remarks during the dinners he shared with them. "Boss never mentioned it, but today's his birthday," Jacob said one evening in late September, ignoring the sharp look Thomas shot him across the table. "Is it?" Violet asked, genuinely surprised. "How old are you?" 34, Thomas answered reluctantly. "And it's not important." "Nonsense," Violet said, rising from the table. "Everyone deserves something special on their birthday." She disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a small cake she'd baked that morning, originally intended for the next day's dessert. Thomas stared at the cake as if unsure what to do with it. "You didn't need to, I know," Violet interrupted gently. "But I wanted to, make a wish." After a moment's hesitation, Thomas blew out the single candle she'd placed in the center. Jacob grinned widely, clapping his boss on the shoulder, a familiarity few would dare with Thomas Xavier. "What did you wish for?" Violet asked as she cut slices for the three of them. Thomas's eyes met hers briefly. "Can't tell you, won't come true." Later, after Jacob had returned to the bunkhouse, Thomas lingered in the kitchen as Violet washed the dishes. He rarely stayed after dinner, usually retreating to his study or heading back out to check on some aspect of the ranch operation. "You didn't have to do that," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I know." She glanced over her shoulder at him, "But birthdays should be celebrated." "Haven't celebrated mine since my sister died," he admitted quietly. "Anna always made a fuss. Cake, presents, the whole thing." Violet dried her hands on her apron, turning to face him fully. "Tell me about her, your sister." For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then he moved to sit at the kitchen table, gesturing for her to join him. "Anna was 4 years younger than me, smart as a whip and twice as sharp-tongued." A genuine smile touched his lips at the memory. "Our parents died when I was 18, she was 14. Influenza. I raised her after that, did whatever work I could find." Violet sat quietly, recognizing that this was perhaps the most Thomas had ever shared with anyone in a long time. She wanted to be a teacher, he continued. Had the education for it too, I made sure of that, was saving up to send her to a proper school back east when she got sick. His voice grew rougher. Typhoid took her in less than a week, nothing I could do. I'm so sorry, Violet said softly, resisting the urge to reach for his hand. Thomas nodded, his eyes distant. After she died, I came out west, worked as a ranch hand, saved every penny. When I had enough, I bought this land, built all this. He gestured vaguely at their surroundings, thought it would give me purpose. And has it? His eyes refocused on her face. Some days. The moment stretched between them, something unspoken passing in the air, then Thomas stood abruptly. Thank you for the cake, it was kind of you. Before Violet could respond, he was gone, the sound of the front door closing behind him echoing through the quiet house. In early October, Thomas announced that he needed to go into Tonopah Junction for supplies, and asked if Violet would accompany him to select fabric for new linens. It would be her first trip back to town since the auction nearly 2 months earlier, and she felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cool, the first hints of autumn touching the landscape. Thomas brought the wagon around to the front of the house while Violet tucked a list of needed items into her pocket. She had dressed carefully in her best dress altered from one of Mrs. Finch's left behind garments, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. Thomas, too, had made an effort, wearing a clean shirt and his good coat, his dark hair freshly trimmed. He helped her onto the wagon seat with a gentle hand at her elbow, his touch lingering for a moment longer than strictly necessary. The ride to town passed pleasantly, Thomas pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the early days of his ranching operation. Violet found herself laughing at his dry observations, discovering a wit beneath his serious exterior that she hadn't fully appreciated before. You should laugh more often, Thomas said unexpectedly as they approached the outskirts of town. It suits you. Violet felt a blush warm her cheeks. I could say the same about you smiling. Their eyes met briefly before Thomas returned his attention to the road, but something had shifted between them, a subtle change in the atmosphere that Violet couldn't quite name but could definitely feel. Tonopah Junction looked much the same as it had 2 months ago, but Violet's perspective had changed. The town that had once represented her humiliation now seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating. Their first stop was the general store, where Thomas instructed her to select whatever household items she needed. The storekeeper, who had been present at the auction, watched with undisguised curiosity as Thomas deferred to Violet's judgment on everything from fabric to cookware. Put it all on my account, Thomas told the storekeeper, who hurried to comply. As they made their way down the main street, Violet became aware of the stares and whispers following them. Thomas noticed too, his posture stiffening as he moved protectively closer to her. Ignore them, he murmured. What they think doesn't matter. Outside the feed store, they encountered one of the men who had bid against Thomas at the auction, Harlan Dowd, a rancher known for his mean disposition and mistreatment of workers. Xavier, Dowd greeted with a mocking tip of his hat. His eyes slid to Violet, a smirk forming on his thin lips. I see you're still carting around your big purchase, getting your money's worth, are you? Thomas's hand moved to his gun belt, his expression darkening. Apologize to the lady, Dowd. Lady, Dowd laughed. That's generous, his words cut off abruptly as Thomas's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling into the dust. A crowd quickly gathered as Dowd scrambled to his feet, reaching for his pistol. I wouldn't, Thomas said calmly, his own weapon already drawn. Now apologize to Miss Greene, or the next one won't be just a love tap. Dowd, his face flushed with anger and humiliation, glanced around at the assembled onlookers. The sheriff had emerged from his office across the street, watching but not intervening. Sorry, Dowd muttered finally, barely audible. Louder, Thomas insisted, so everyone can hear you. I apologize, Miss Greene, Dowd ground out, his eyes burning with hatred. Thomas holstered his weapon. Good, now get out of our way. As Dowd slunk off, Violet realized she was trembling. No one had ever defended her honor like that, certainly not her father, who had been a gentle soul but no fighter, and not the young men of Tanapa Junction, who had always overlooked her in favor of prettier, slimmer girls. You didn't have to do that, she said softly as Thomas led her toward the wagon, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Yes, I did, he replied firmly. No one speaks to you that way, not while I'm around. His words warmed something deep inside her, a feeling she was afraid to examine too closely. Thomas Xavier was her employer, not her suitor, and in 10 more months their arrangement would end. It would be foolish to imagine anything more. Yet as they completed their errands and headed back to the ranch, Violet couldn't help noticing how Thomas's expression softened when he looked at her, or how his hand brushed hers as he helped her down from the wagon. Little things, perhaps meaningless, but they stirred a hope in her heart that she thought had died long ago. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow by mid-November. The cattle were brought in closer to the barns, and the rhythm of ranch life slowed to match the season. Thomas spent more time at the house, often working at the desk in his study while Violet baked or mended by the fire in the sitting room. They fell into a comfortable routine, sharing meals and conversations that grew increasingly personal as the days shortened and the nights lengthened. Violet learned that Thomas enjoyed reading history books and had a surprising talent for whittling. He discovered her passion for storytelling and her secret dream of one day writing down the tales she'd made up as a child. On a particularly cold December evening, with snow piling against the windows and the wind howling down the chimney, Thomas surprised Violet by appearing in the kitchen with a bottle of good whiskey and 2 glasses. Thought we might both use something to warm up, he explained, setting the glasses on the table. Violet, who had been preparing dough for the next morning's bread, wiped her hands on her apron. I've never actually had whiskey before. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Never. She shook her head, smiling slightly. My father didn't drink, and it wasn't considered proper for unmarried ladies. Well, he said, pouring a small amount into each glass, there's no one here to judge what's proper or not. Violet accepted the glass, lifting it hesitantly to her lips. The whiskey burned going down, making her cough, but the warmth that spread through her chest afterward was pleasant. Thomas chuckled at her expression. Takes some getting used to. It's not so bad, she said, taking another small sip. This time, she was prepared for the burn, and it seemed less intense. Actually, it's rather nice. They moved to the sitting room where Thomas built up the fire before joining her on the sofa closer than he would normally sit, but not inappropriately so. The whiskey had relaxed them both, and their conversation flowed more easily than ever before. Do you ever get lonely out here? Violet asked, watching the firelight play across his features. Thomas considered the question, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I used to, not so much anymore. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Violet felt her heart quicken. What about you? Thomas asked quietly. Are you lonely, Violet? She met his gaze, finding something in his blue eyes that gave her courage. Not anymore. Thomas set his glass down on the small table beside the sofa, then gently took hers and placed it next to his. His hand moved to cover hers, warm and calloused and somehow exactly right. I've been wanting to tell you something, he said, his voice low. These past months having you here. It's changed things, changed me. Violet barely dared to breathe. How so? I've been alone for a long time, by choice mostly. After Anna died, it seemed easier not to let anyone get close. He paused, his thumb moving in a small circle against her wrist. But you made this place a home again. Made me remember what it's like to look forward to coming back at the end of the day. Thomas, she whispered, hardly believing what she was hearing. I know your contract says you're free to go in August, he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. And I'll honor that if it's what you want. But I'm hoping, I'm hoping you might consider staying. As your housekeeper, Violet asked, needing to be certain of his meaning. Thomas shook his head slowly. No, as more than that, much more. He leaned forward, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but Violet had no desire to retreat. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened as years of loneliness gave way to newfound passion. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Thomas pressed his forehead to hers. I think I've been falling in love with you since the day I saw you on that auction block. The words she'd never expected to hear from anyone, let alone a man like Thomas Xavier, brought tears to Violet's eyes. I've been falling in love with you too. I just never thought you could feel the same about someone like me. Thomas drew back slightly, his brow furrowing. Someone like you? You mean someone kind, intelligent, and beautiful? Beautiful, Violet echoed in disbelief. Thomas, I know what I look like. I'm not, you're beautiful to me, he interrupted firmly. I don't give a damn what anyone else thinks or what you've been told. When I look at you, I see everything I never knew I wanted until you came into my life. He kissed her again, as if to seal the truth of his words, and Violet felt something long broken within her begin to heal. They stayed by the fire late into the night, talking and sharing gentle touches, redefining their relationship with each passing hour. By the time the embers had died down to glowing coals, Violet knew with certainty that her future had irrevocably changed. Thomas insisted on doing things properly. Though they both knew where their hearts stood, he was determined that their relationship should progress with all due respect to Violet's reputation. He formally released her from her indenture contract the very next day, making her a free woman well ahead of the promised date. You're not obligated to stay now, he told her as they stood in his study, the torn contract between them on the desk. I want you to be here because you choose to be, not because a piece of paper says you must. Violet's response was to kiss him soundly, delighting in his surprised expression. I'm not going anywhere, Thomas Xavier. You're stuck with me now. Their courtship unfolded throughout the winter months, observed with knowing smiles by the ranch hands and occasional visitors. Jacob, in particular, seemed pleased by the development, confiding to Violet one evening when Thomas was out of earshot. Never seen the boss this happy. Not in all the years I've known him. By spring, Thomas had asked Violet to marry him, presenting her with a delicate gold ring that had belonged to his mother. They were married in April 1879 in a small ceremony at the ranch, attended by the ranch hands, a few townspeople who had shown kindness to Violet in the past, and even Emma, Violet's sister, who traveled from California with her husband and young son. The wedding feast was a joyous affair, with tables set up in the ranch yard and music provided by one of the cowhands who played a passable fiddle. As evening fell and lanterns were lit, Thomas pulled his new wife aside, away from the celebration. Happy, he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Violet nodded, resting her head against his chest. More than I ever thought possible. I have something to show you, Thomas said, taking her hand. He led her toward the barn where a covered wagon stood ready, packed with supplies and hitched to two sturdy horses. What's this? Violet asked, puzzled. Thomas grinned a full, unrestrained smile that transformed his normally serious face. Our wedding trip. 2 weeks, just you and me, up in the high country. Jacob can handle things here. Violet laughed with delight. When do we leave? Now, if you're willing. I thought we might slip away while everyone's celebrating. Head up to that spot I told you about, with the hot springs and the view of the valley. The idea of escaping with her new husband to a private paradise was irresistible. They left quietly, with only Jacob aware of their departure, the sounds of the wedding celebration fading behind them as they headed into the foothills. Their honeymoon was everything Violet could have dreamed, days spent exploring the beautiful wilderness, evenings by the campfire, and nights discovering each other with increasing passion and tenderness. Thomas proved to be a gentle and considerate lover, his touch making Violet feel beautiful and desired in ways she had never imagined possible. On their last night before returning to the ranch, they lay together beneath the stars, Thomas's arms wrapped around her as they watched the moon rise over the distant mountains. "I never thought I could be this happy," Violet confessed, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "Growing up, I always felt like I was too much, too big, too loud, too different, like there wasn't a place for me." Thomas's arms tightened around her. "You were exactly what I needed, exactly who I needed, and I thank God every day for bringing you to me, even if it was through that damn auction." Violet smiled, thinking of how far they'd come from that hot summer day less than a year ago. "I think I fell in love with you the moment you glared that crowd into silence. I wanted to shoot the lot of them," Thomas admitted, "but I figured that might complicate my plan to court you properly." Their laughter mingled in the night air, a sound of pure happiness that echoed across the moonlit landscape. When they returned to the Xavier ranch, their ranch-now life settled into a new pattern. Violet was no longer the housekeeper, but the mistress of the house, though she still enjoyed cooking and keeping their home beautiful. Thomas included her in the business decisions of the ranch, valuing her sharp mind and practical suggestions. By their first anniversary, Violet was with child, her body changing in ways that brought a new kind of wonder to both of them. Thomas was endearingly protective, insisting she rest more and hiring a young woman from town to help with the heavier household tasks. Their son, Samuel, was born in November 1880, a healthy, robust baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dimpled smile. Thomas, who had faced down rustlers and survived blizzards without flinching, was completely undone by the tiny infant placed in his arms. "He's perfect," he whispered, a tear tracking unashamedly down his weathered cheek, "just like his mother." As Samuel grew, the Xavier Ranch prospered along with him. Thomas expanded their operations, buying adjacent land and increasing their herd. Violet started a small garden that grew into a productive kitchen farm, providing vegetables for their table and extras to sell in town. Their second child, a daughter they named Anna after Thomas's sister, arrived in the summer of 1882, completing their family. The house that had once been so Spartan was now filled with children's laughter, toys scattered across the rugs Violet had added, and family portraits hanging on walls that had once been bare. Tonopah Junction changed too over the years. The railroad came through in 1885, bringing new opportunities and new faces. Thomas's business acumen and fair dealings had earned him respect throughout the territory, and when Nevada achieved statehood, he was asked to serve on various civic committees. Violet, too, found her place in the community. The same people who had once mocked her size now sought her advice on everything from child-rearing to preserving food for winter. She started a small lending library in town, sharing her love of books with children and adults alike. And sometimes, when new settlers arrived or traveling shows came through, Violet would overhear whispers about that big woman married to the Xavier rancher. On those occasions, she would invariably find Thomas at her side, his hand taking hers, his eyes challenging anyone to speak their thoughts aloud. But mostly, those instances grew fewer as the years passed. What had once seemed remarkable that a man like Thomas Xavier would choose a woman of Violet's size for his wife gradually became simply the way things were. They were the Xaviers, respected, prosperous, and by any measure, deeply in love. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas surprised Violet with a trip to San Francisco, their first real journey away from the ranch since their wedding. They stayed in a grand hotel, attended the theater, and walked arm in arm along the waterfront, as comfortable together as they had been since those early days by the fire. Any regrets? Thomas asked her one evening as they watched the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, his arm draped around her shoulders. Violet looked up at the man who had changed her life that day at the auction block, whose love had given her not just a home but a sense of her own worth. The years had added a touch of silver to his temples and new lines around his eyes, but to her, he was more handsome than ever. "Not a single one," she replied, leaning up to kiss him. "How could I regret the greatest blessing of my life?" Thomas smiled that full smile that had once been so rare but now graced his face regularly. "That's good, because I plan to keep you for at least another 50 years. "Is that a promise, Mr. Xavier?" Violet asked, her eyes twinkling. "It's a guarantee, Mrs. Xavier," he replied, pulling her close as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. In the spring of 1898, 20 years after that fateful auction in Tonopah Junction, the Xavier Ranch hosted a celebration for Samuel's 18th birthday. The property had grown to over 10,000 acres, one of the largest and most successful operations in the state. The original house had been expanded several times, though Violet had insisted on keeping the original sitting room exactly as it was, right down to the sofa where Thomas had first confessed his feelings. Friends and neighbors gathered under a canopy of white tents set up in the ranch yard. Samuel, tall and confident like his father but with Violet's warmth and easy laugh, moved among the guests as the guest of honor. 15-year-old Anna, already showing signs of the beauty she would become, played the piano Thomas had imported from Boston for her 13th birthday. As Violet watched her family, a wave of gratitude washed over her. From the deepest humiliation of her life had come its greatest joy: a husband who adored her, children who made her proud, and a life richer than any she could have imagined that summer day in 1878. Thomas appeared at her side, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "Penny for your thoughts, my love." Violet accepted the glass, her fingers brushing his. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, how different things might have been if you hadn't been at that auction." "I believe we would have found each other somehow," Thomas said, his voice sure. "Some things are simply meant to be." As they stood together watching their children and the life they'd built, Violet knew he was right. The path hadn't always been easy. There had been droughts and difficult winters, times when the ranch barely broke even, the loss of Thomas's closest friend Jacob to pneumonia 5 years earlier, but through it all, they had faced each challenge together. "To us," Thomas said, raising his glass in a private toast, "and to that auction block that brought you to me." Violet laughed, clinking her glass against his. "To us, and to a man brave enough to bid loud and glare until they stopped." They shared a smile that held 20 years of memories. The crowds and mockery of the past long faded into insignificance compared to the love that had grown between them, a love that had started with a defiant bid and a journey home, and had become the cornerstone of a life neither of them could have imagined on their own. As the celebration continued around them, Thomas took Violet's hand, leading her away from the crowds toward the creek that ran through their property, the same creek where they had stopped that first day, when they were still strangers to each other. The afternoon sun filtered through the cottonwood trees, dappling the ground with patterns of light and shadow. "Remember the first time I brought you here?" Thomas asked, his voice soft with memory. Violet nodded, squeezing his hand. "You told me you didn't like bullies. I thought you were the strangest man I'd ever met, rescuing me just to make a point." Thomas laughed, the sound echoing across the water. "I told myself that's all it was, that I just needed a housekeeper and happened to dislike how they were treating you." He shook his head. "But even then, there was something about you, Violet, something that drew me to you from the first moment I saw you standing on that platform with your head held high despite everything." "I was terrified," she admitted. "Inside, I was falling apart. But I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry." "You were the bravest person in that square," Thomas said, pulling her into his arms. "You still are." They stood together by the creek, the sounds of the party a distant murmur, wrapped in a moment that belonged only to them. 20 years of marriage had changed them, both silver threaded through Violet's dark hair now. And the lines around Thomas's eyes had deepened, but the way they looked at each other remained unchanged, a constant in a world that had transformed around them. Later that night, after the guests had departed and their children had retired to their rooms, Thomas and Violet sat together on the porch swing, a quilt draped across their laps against the evening chill. The ranch spread out before them, peaceful in the moonlight. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Samuel will be heading to college in the fall, Anna not far behind him. Maybe it's time we did some of that traveling you've always talked about." Violet looked up at him in surprise. "You'd leave the ranch for how long?" "Not permanently," he clarified. "But Jacob's son is more than capable of running things for a few months at a stretch. We could see some of those places you've read about all these years. New York, Boston, maybe even Europe." The idea was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. Except for their trip to San Francisco and occasional visits to Violet's sister in California, they had rarely ventured far from Tonopah Junction. "You do that for me?" Violet asked softly. Thomas smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. "I do anything for you, Violet Xavier. Haven't you figured that out by now?" she laughed, nestling closer against his side. "I suppose I have, and yes, I'd love to travel with you to see the world beyond Nevada. Then it's settled. Once Samuel's situated at college, we'll start planning." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But no matter where we go, this will always be home." Violet nodded, her eyes taking in the ranch that had been the setting for their love story. From the barn where Thomas had taught Samuel to ride his first pony, to the apple trees they'd planted when Anna was born, to the rose garden that bloomed each summer beneath their bedroom window, every inch of the property held memories of the life they'd built together. "Home is wherever you are," she said simply, turning her face up to his. Thomas kissed her then, with the same tenderness and passion that had marked their very first kiss by the fire all those years ago. When they parted, his blue eyes held hers in the moonlight. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said, echoing words she had spoken to him on their honeymoon. "Never thought I deserved it." "You deserve everything good in this world, Thomas Xavier," Violet replied, her hand resting over his heart. "And I intend to spend the rest of my days making sure you know it." As the night deepened around them, stars blanketing the Nevada sky, Violet reflected on the journey that had brought them here from a humiliating auction to a love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. She thought of all the moments, large and small, that had shaped their life together. The birth of their children, the expansion of the ranch, the quiet evenings by the fire, the challenges overcome side by side. What had begun with mockery and cruelty had transformed into something beautiful beyond measure, a testament to the power of one man's courage to stand against a crowd, and one woman's strength to believe she deserved happiness. And as Thomas's arms tightened around her, Violet knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be, and exactly who she was meant to be with now and for all the days to come.